History often smooths out the rough edges of the past, but the Old West refuses to fit into that neat version. Behind the gunfights and outlaw stories are decisions and events that feel almost impossible to believe. From laws that should never have existed to moments that changed lives in seconds. The truth is far more unpredictable than the legends, and today you will hear 20 Old West facts almost no one was meant to remember. Number 20. The Army's Camel Experiment. In 1856, the United States Army received 34 camels imported from Egypt and Turkey. It was a government-approved program with a $30,000 budget, backed by Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who would later become President of the Confederacy. His reasoning was practical. The Southwest desert was brutal on horses and mules, so why not use animals built for that exact terrain? The camels worked. They carried loads twice as heavy as any mule, needed almost no water, and ate desert scrub that other animals refused to touch. A second shipment brought the total herd to about 70 camels, stationed at Camp Verde, roughly 100 kilometers north of San Antonio. The Army was genuinely impressed. So what went wrong? Soldiers hated them. The camels spit, stank, and sent every nearby horse into full panic. Reports say soldiers would deliberately release them, hoping they would escape. When the Civil War broke out, the program collapsed. The camels were sold off or simply let loose to wander the desert. Here is the part nobody mentions. Wild camels were reported roaming the American Southwest as late as the 1950s. If that sounds strange, wait until you hear what a railroad company did next as a publicity stunt. Number 19. The Stage Train Crash. September 15, 1896. A Texas railroad company set two massive locomotives on a collision course, invited over 40,000 spectators, and let them run. This was entirely deliberate. William George Crush, a passenger agent for the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, designed the stunt to sell tickets. He built a temporary town, laid 6 kilometers of special track, drilled wells for drinking water, and borrowed circus tents from Ringling Brothers. The crowd that showed up was larger than the second biggest city in Texas at the time. The two engines, one painted red and one painted green, were sent rolling toward each other at between 70 and 100 kilometers per hour. The crowd fell silent. Then both locomotives hit, reared up like fighting animals, and both boilers exploded simultaneously. Steel shrapnel tore through the crowd. At least 3 people died. A flying bolt destroyed the eye of the official photographer, who was standing barely 30 meters away. William Crush was fired immediately. He was rehired the next day because the publicity had been enormous. Composer Scott Joplin wrote a commemorative piano piece within weeks. Texas responded by passing a law specifically banning staged train wrecks, which raises an obvious question. What kind of place needs a specific law banning that? Number 18. Wild Bill Hickok's Last Chair. Wild Bill Hickok was one of the most famous gunfighters of the Old West. He was sharp, dangerous, and deeply paranoid about his own survival. His one firm rule at every card game was simple: always sit with his back to the wall. That way he could see the door and no one could approach him from behind. On August 2, 1876, Hickok walked into Nuttall and Mann's saloon in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, and the only available seat was facing away from the door. He asked the man sitting in the safe chair to swap. The man refused. 30 minutes later, a failed gambler named Jack McCall walked in behind Hickok and shot him in the back of the head at point-blank range. Hickok died instantly, aged 39. When the cards fell from his hands, he was holding 2 black aces and 2 black eights. That combination became permanently known as the dead man's hand. Poker players around the world still treat those cards with superstitious unease. McCall was acquitted that same day by a minors' court, a decision so outrageous it sparked a legal firestorm. He was retried, convicted, and hanged. But Hickok was still dead, over a chair. The man who came next in legend had barely any time left at all, and we will get to him shortly. First, let us talk about a dentist who should not have lived long enough to become a gunfighter. Number 17. Doc Holliday's death sentence. John Henry Holliday graduated from dental school in 1872, then received a diagnosis that ended the life he had planned: tuberculosis. In the 1870s, this was essentially a slow death sentence. Doctors told him the dry desert air of the Southwest might extend his life by a few years, so he headed west. When you are already dying at 22, the fear of getting shot in a bar fight tends to lose its grip. That psychological freedom made Holliday one of the most terrifying men on the frontier. He became a professional gambler and gunfighter, known across the West as someone who simply did not care whether he lived or died. This made him extraordinarily dangerous. His closest friend was Wyatt Earp, and whenever Earp needed backup, Holliday showed up without hesitation. He spent years coughing through gunfights, winning at cards, and brawling in saloons, all while his body slowly deteriorated from a disease that was supposed to kill him quickly. Doc Holliday died in his bed in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, on November 8, 1887. His reported last words were, "This is funny." He had expected to die by gunshot for 15 years. He was 36. You will hear more about the gunfight that made him a legend at number 15. But first, here is a bandit who figured out a far more polite way to rob people. Number 16. Black Bart, the Polite Bandit. Between 1875 and 1883, a man in a flour sack mask and a bowler hat robbed at least 28 Wells Fargo stagecoaches across Northern California and Southern Oregon. He always worked alone, always on foot, and in nearly a decade of holdups, he never once fired the shotgun he was carrying. After two of his robberies, investigators arrived to find a handwritten poem left inside the strongbox. He signed them Black Bart, the P.O.8, his stylized way of writing poet. The man behind the mask was Charles Bowles, a Civil War veteran with a personal grudge against Wells Fargo from a mining dispute. He was also terrified of horses, which is why he walked to every single robbery site on foot. Between holdups, he lived in San Francisco under a false name, wore fine clothes, carried a gold-handled cane, and dined at the best restaurants in the city. When Wells Fargo finally caught him in 1884, police described him as someone of great endurance who was extremely polite and proper in behavior. He served 4 years, was released, and simply disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to him after 1888. Number 15. The gunfight that wasn't at the OK Corral. You have heard of it. You have probably seen it in at least one film, typically drawn out into several minutes of slow-motion drama. Here is what actually happened. The gunfight at the OK Corral did not take place at the OK Corral. It happened in a narrow lot, roughly 4.5 meters wide, next to a photography studio on Fremont Street, 6 doors from the corral's rear entrance. It was named after the corral afterward because gunfight in the vacant lot near the OK Corral does not sell film tickets. Here is what most people skip. It started over a gun control law. Tombstone, Arizona had an ordinance making it illegal to carry firearms inside city limits. The Earp brothers and Doc Holliday went to enforce it. On October 26, 1881, 6 or 7 men fired about 30 shots in approximately 30 seconds. 3 cowboys were dead. Doc Holliday was grazed. 2 Earps were wounded. Wyatt walked away without a scratch. A film later stretched this into an 11-minute action sequence. The real confrontation lasted about as long as a commercial break. Perhaps the strangest part is that Wyatt Earp spent decades as a nearly forgotten figure until a ghost-written biography in 1931 turned 30 Seconds of Chaos into the defining myth of the American West. Number 14. Oregon's Black Exclusion Law. This one is going to make you reread it. In 1844, the Provisional Government of Oregon passed what became known as the Oregon Exclusion Law. It declared that black people were not permitted to live in Oregon. Any free black person who remained in the territory would be subject to flogging at regular intervals until they left, a minimum of 20 lashes and a maximum of 39. This was not a fringe proposal. It passed. When Oregon became a state in 1859, the exclusion clause was written directly into the state constitution. What makes this particularly striking is that Oregon was not a slave state. The men who pushed this law were not defending a plantation economy. They simply wanted a racially homogeneous territory in the Pacific Northwest and wrote that goal into law. The exclusion clause was not removed from Oregon's constitution until 1926. The racist language was not formally deleted from the document until 2000. Within living memory of people alive today, Oregon's founding document contained a clause banning an entire population from existing within its borders. This did not appear in most history textbooks, and it certainly did not make it into the cowboy films. Number 13. Deadwood had no right to exist. When gold was discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota in 1874, thousands of prospectors flooded the area. The problem was that the Black Hills were guaranteed to the Lakota Sioux by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The U.S. government had signed that treaty. It was binding federal law. What the prospectors were doing was illegal trespass on protected native land, and the U.S. Army was supposed to stop them. The Army tried half-heartedly and failed. The gold seekers kept coming. By 1876, Deadwood had thousands of residents, multiple saloons, a thriving gambling scene, and absolutely no legal right to exist. The U.S. government eventually responded not by removing the settlers, but by pressuring the Sioux to sell the Black Hills under conditions that many historians consider coercive at best. The town made famous through novels and television was built on land seized through treaty violations and applied pressure. Wild Bill Hickok was shot there. Calamity Jane lived there. None of them were technically supposed to be there at all. Deadwood was an illegal settlement that became a legend, and the moral questions around how it came to exist rarely appear alongside the romanticized stories of its most famous residents. Which brings us to one of the most remarkable women those same streets ever produced. Number 12. Poker Alice. Alice Ivers was born in England, raised by a vicar father, and arrived in America as a teenager with no particular plan to become one of the most feared card players on the frontier. But when her first husband, a mining engineer, died in a workplace accident, Alice needed income. She sat down at a poker table and discovered a natural talent for reading people, calculating odds, and keeping a completely unreadable face under pressure. For decades, she traveled the mining camps and frontier towns of Colorado, New Mexico, and the Dakotas, sitting across from cowboys, outlaws, and miners and systematically beating them. She smoked cigars at the table, wore expensive clothes, and refused to play on Sundays out of firm religious principle. She also carried a pistol and used it at least once to discourage a man who thought he could take back what she had won. By some estimates, she earned the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars over her career. She ran her own gambling house in the Dakotas well into her 70s. Alice Ivers died in 1930 in Sturgis, South Dakota, having outlasted most of the gunslingers she shared a frontier with by a comfortable margin. Number 11. Calamity Jane's Last Wish. Martha Jane Cannery, known across the frontier as Calamity Jane, was a scout, sharpshooter, and frontier woman who dressed in men's clothing at a time when that was deeply scandalous. She drove stagecoaches, worked as a scout for General George Crook, and spent much of her life building and embellishing her own legend. She claimed a romantic connection to Wild Bill Hickok, though historians debate the details. What is not in dispute is what she requested when she was dying. Calamity Jane died on August 1, 1903, in Terry, South Dakota, from inflammation of the lungs. Her final documented wish was to be buried next to Wild Bill Hickok in Mount Moriah Cemetery in Deadwood. She had lived for 27 years after his death. Locals honored the request. Their graves sit side by side in Deadwood to this day. Visitors can stand between the two headstones and decide for themselves what kind of story they want to believe about the two of them. It is one of the quieter, stranger endings in Old West history. Two people connected by rumor and legend, finally placed next to each other in permanent silence. But quiet endings were rare out here. Number 10. the gunfighter who studied law in prison. John Wesley Hardin is not a name most people know, but the numbers attached to his life are hard to believe. Born in Texas in 1853 to a Methodist preacher, Hardin killed his first man at 15. By 25, he had killed somewhere between 20 and 42 people, depending on which account you believe. His own memoir claimed 42. Historians conservatively verify at least 20. Either number makes him significantly more lethal than Billy the Kid, Jesse James, or almost anyone else romanticized by the era. In 1877, Texas Ranger John Armstrong boarded a train, walked up behind Hardin, and caught him by the suspenders as he reached for his weapon. Hardin was convicted of murder and sentenced to 25 years in Texas State Penitentiary. Here is the part that sounds invented. In prison, he studied law. He read legal texts, corresponded with lawyers, and educated himself through every resource available. He was pardoned in 1894 after 17 years, and he immediately passed the Texas bar exam. He set up a practice in El Paso. He was shot and killed in the Acme Saloon on August 19, 1895, reportedly over a gambling dispute before his legal career went anywhere. He was 42. Number 9. The town called the Widowmaker. Delamar, Nevada sits in the desert about 45 kilometers south of Pioche, and at its peak in the 1890s, it had a population of roughly 1,500 people. It was a gold and silver mining camp, which meant men worked long shifts underground and in the stamp mills crushing ore. The problem was the dust. The ore at Delamar released microscopic silica particles when crushed, and the men working in the mills and shafts breathed those particles constantly. Inhaled regularly over months or years, silica dust causes silicosis, a disease that slowly fills and destroys the lungs. Nobody stopped the work. Nobody adequately protected the workers. The men kept going in, and the mortality rate climbed to a point where Delamar earned the name history gave it, the Widowmaker. At one point, more than 400 widows lived in a town of 1,500 people. Think about what that ratio means. The town that gave men their paychecks also gave the women their black dresses, and the same operations kept running because the ore kept paying. Today, the ruins of Delamar sit in the desert, mostly collapsed, largely forgotten, and still technically contaminated. Number 8. The Buffalo Soldiers. After the Civil War, Congress authorized 4 all-black regiments for service on the western frontier, the 9th and 10th Cavalries and the 24th and 25th Infantries. These became the Buffalo Soldiers, a name given to them by Native American fighters who connected their tightly coiled hair to the mane of the buffalo. The soldiers adopted the name with pride and eventually placed a buffalo on the 10th Cavalry's regimental crest. Here is the part that should stop you cold. These men signed up to fight for a country that had just freed them from slavery, denied them equal rights, refused them the vote, and routinely turned them away from spaces available to white Americans. While Buffalo Soldiers were fighting Apache warriors in the Southwest, black men, women, and children were being lynched in the East. Back at their own posts, the Buffalo Soldiers received worse horses, inferior equipment, and second-hand uniforms. 18 of them were awarded the Medal of Honor for their service. Several also served as the country's first National Park Rangers, protecting Yosemite and Sequoia before the National Park Service even existed. Number 7. The Lawman Born in Chains. Bass Reeves was born into slavery in Arkansas in 1838. He escaped during the Civil War, crossed into Indian Territory, and spent years among indigenous nations, learning to speak several native languages fluently. After the war, when the federal government needed lawmen to police the vast, violent expanse of Indian Territory, Reeves became one of the first black deputy U.S. Marshals west of the Mississippi. He was assigned to patrol roughly 200,000 square kilometers of territory. Over his career, Bass Reeves arrested over 3,000 felons. He was shot at hundreds of times. His hat was shot off. His belt was shot off. He was never hit. He used disguises constantly, once spending a week undercover as a vagrant to catch a murderer. He allegedly arrested his own son for murder and brought him in without incident. He carried handcuffs on one hip and a Bible on the other. Decades later, a masked lawman appeared in radio dramas and then on television with a Native American companion, a strict moral code, and habits that looked almost identical to those of Bass Reeves. That character was called the Lone Ranger. The producers, when asked, denied any connection. Reeves's story stayed buried for nearly a century. Number 6. Jesse James, celebrity outlaw. Jesse James killed people. He robbed banks and trains across Missouri, Kansas, and Kentucky for roughly 15 years. None of that is in dispute. What rarely gets examined is how he became famous, because Jesse James had something almost no other outlaw of his era possessed: a skilled publicist. His name was John Newman Edwards, a Confederate newspaper editor in Missouri, who wrote glowing accounts of James's robberies, framing each heist as righteous rebellion by a Confederate veteran against the corrupt banks and railroads squeezing poor farmers. Edwards shaped the narrative, and the narrative shaped the legend. During his lifetime, James received fan letters and was celebrated in dime novels while still actively committing crimes. Ordinary citizens in Missouri genuinely protected him, fed him, and hid him from law enforcement because the press had convinced them he was on their side. The robberies came at real cost to real people, but those people did not have a newspaper editor telling their story. When Robert Ford shot James in the back of the head in his own home on April 3, 1882, the press turned it into a martyrdom. A man who had robbed and killed across multiple states was mourned like a folk hero, because a skilled writer had spent a decade deciding that is what he should be. Number 5. Billy the Kid was 21 and his name was Henry McCarty. His legal name was Henry McCarty. He also went by Henry Antrim and William Bonney at various points in his short life. Billy the Kid was a nickname. Despite being one of the most recognizable names in outlaw history, he died at 21 years old, shot in the dark by Sheriff Pat Garrett on July 14, 1881, in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. His kill count is hotly debated. He claimed 21 men, one for each year of his life. Historians place the verified number somewhere between 4 and 8. What makes his story genuinely strange is how young he was for every single moment of it. He committed his first documented killing at 17. He escaped from the Lincoln County Jail at 19, killing 2 armed guards in the process. He spent the last year of his life riding through New Mexico knowing that Pat Garrett, a former friend, had been specifically appointed to hunt him down. He was 21 years and 1 month old when he died. That is younger than most university graduates today. He had already been in multiple gunfights, escaped custody twice, been charged with multiple murders, and had his face on wanted posters across the territory. His youth is part of what made the legend last. But the man who killed him had his own strange ending coming. Number 4. The man who killed Billy. The kid died unsolved. Pat Garrett was celebrated as a hero for shooting Billy the Kid. He converted the fame into political positions and lawman roles across New Mexico and Texas. But the celebrity faded faster than he expected, and Garrett spent the next 2 decades struggling financially and politically. By 1908, he was living on a leased ranch near Las Cruces, New Mexico, locked in a bitter land dispute with a tenant he despised. On February 29, 1908, Pat Garrett was found shot dead on a road outside Las Cruces. He was 57. He had been shot once in the back of the head and once in the stomach. A man named Wayne Brazel was arrested and confessed, claiming self-defense. At trial, Brazel was acquitted in a jury deliberation that lasted just 15 minutes. Nobody else was ever charged. Historians have debated ever since whether Brazel acted alone, whether a more powerful figure arranged the killing, and whether the land dispute was even the real motive. The man who shot Billy the Kid was himself shot in the back on a dirt road, and no one was ever properly held responsible. That kind of justice, bending around money and power and land, was also on full display in a certain judge's courtroom west of the Pecos. Number 3. Judge Roy Bean, the law he invented himself. Roy Bean was appointed Justice of the Peace for Pecos County, Texas in 1882, and from that point held all proceedings in his combination saloon and courtroom, a building he called the Jersey Lily in the town of Langtree. He had minimal understanding of actual law and maximum confidence in his own authority. He called himself the law west of the Pecos, and in the absence of any competing legal infrastructure, the title was essentially accurate. His rulings were legendary for their creativity. He once held an inquest over a dead man found with a pistol and $41 on his person. Bean fined the corpse $41 for carrying a concealed weapon, pocketed the money, and declared the case closed. He acquitted a man for shooting a Chinese railroad worker because he could find no law making it illegal, a ruling so grotesque it speaks volumes about who the legal system protected and who it simply did not consider. He reportedly married and divorced couples using invented ceremonies and released a man charged with murder because the victim had started the fight. Appeals were technically possible but required traveling hundreds of kilometers through difficult terrain to reach another judge. Most people simply accepted whatever Bean decided. Number 2. Wyatt Earp. Died in bed at 80. After the gunfight near the OK Corral, after the vendetta ride where he tracked down the men who murdered his brother Morgan, after Tombstone and Dodge City and Wichita, Wyatt Earp kept living. He drifted through mining booms in Colorado, Idaho, and Alaska. He refereed boxing matches, including one that caused a national scandal. He tried gambling in San Francisco, tried mining again, made money, lost it, and started over multiple times. By the 1920s, he was living in Los Angeles. Hollywood had begun making westerns, and the old lawman from Tombstone found himself surrounded by film stars and directors who wanted to hear from the real thing. He became friends with Tom Mix, William S. Hart, and a young actor named John Wayne, who reportedly spent time listening to Earp describe how gunfights actually worked and how lawmen actually moved. Wyatt Earp, the man who had walked toward armed men in a vacant lot in Arizona 40 years earlier, lived long enough to watch his own story become a global myth while he sat in Los Angeles trying to sell his memoirs. He died on January 13, 1929, of prostate cancer in his own home at 80 years old. His wife lived until 1944. The frontier had been over for decades. But one thing from that era is still being argued about in Congress right now, and it is the most staggering item on this entire list. Number 1. 20 Medals of Honor for the Wounded Knee Massacre. December 29, 1890. On the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, a detachment of the U.S. 7th Cavalry approached a camp of Lakota Sioux people to disarm them. The Lakota were followers of the Ghost Dance movement, a spiritual revival the U.S. government had decided was a threat to order. What happened next is one of the most heavily documented and least acknowledged events in American history. A struggle broke out over a rifle belonging to a man who was reportedly deaf and may not have understood the commands being given to him. A shot went off and the 7th Cavalry opened fire, equipped with standard rifles and 4 Hotchkiss guns capable of firing 43 rounds per minute. When the firing stopped, between 250 and 300 Lakota people were dead, the majority of them women, children, and elderly. The Army lost 25 soldiers, many killed by crossfire from their own weapons. The commanding general sent a telegram calling it a wholesale massacre. In the months that followed, the U.S. Army awarded 20 Medals of Honor to soldiers who participated. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration the United States government awards. For context, only 25 have been awarded in the 21 years since the September 11th attacks. Congress passed a resolution in 1990 expressing deep regret. They did not revoke the medals. A review panel convened in 2022. In September 2025, the Secretary of Defense announced the soldiers would keep their honors, calling them brave. Native American organizations, Lakota descendants, and members of Congress are still fighting to have them rescinded through legislation called the Remove the Stain Act. It has been introduced and blocked multiple times. This is not history that was quietly resolved. It is an active, unresolved argument about what America chooses to call heroism, happening right now. How different do you think the Old West really was compared to how movies show it today? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fascinating content.